This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. What's it like getting old, and how are baby boomers handling it? Michael Kinsley talks about that and more in Old Age, A Beginner's Guide.
The World War II generation will be remembered for this enormous heroism they showed in winning World War II. And what will we have to show?
Plus, a former interrogator in Iraq writes about scars from the war. Eric Fair's new book is Consequence, a memoir.
I wasn't questioning the legal application of these techniques, but I was certainly, from the beginning, questioning the moral application.
The Pulitzers were announced this week, and novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen is here for a victory visit.
And then all of a sudden, the Twitter feed, Facebook feed started to blow up, and I had to really double-check to make sure that was true.
Alexandra Alter has literary news and something new. I'll talk with Greg Cowles and Parul Sehgal about what we and other people are reading. Lots of you know Michael Kinsley's byline, a founder of Slate, an editor at Harper's, The New Republic, The Washington Monthly, pretty much every major magazine and newspaper. In 1994, Kinsley was diagnosed with Parkinson's. He was only 43. His essay about that diagnosis, the aging process, about how boomers are dealing with getting old, ran in The New Yorker in 2014. He's now expanded that essay into a new book, Old Age, A Beginner's Guide. Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
The book is called Old Age, A Beginner's Guide, and it's a great title and a great subtitle. And I'm curious, did you come up with the title before you wrote the book, or did that come out of the writing of the book, and how did you get there?
Oh, I wanted to call it Mine is Longer Than Yours, which was the original title of the piece that comes out of it. But they decided that Tim Dugan Books, that was too vulgar.
So you were overruled.
Yeah, and we played around with an introduction to old age. Where should the colon go? That wasn't one of the suggestions.
Oh, that's great. Unintended double entendre. You start off saying at the very beginning of the book that it's not a book about Parkinson's disease. It kind of is, but why is it not a book about Parkinson's?
I mean, that is a bit disingenuous. If you want to think that it's a book about Parkinson's disease and buy it under that false pretense, feel free. But it occurred to me that there was a parallel between the progress of something like Parkinson's disease and the progress of life itself. Getting old and getting Parkinson's are fairly similar, and usually they overlap, although not in the case of, well, me or Michael J. Fox or some of the other better-known victims.
But why did you not want to write about, or why do you say that it's not a book about Parkinson's? You have obviously a larger subject that you wanted to write about here.
Yes, I didn't want, and there are so many books, and there will be many more, about my disease. I just didn't want to write about my disease, but I sort of ended up doing it anyway. But it's actually just an example, Parkinson's, in the book, or at least that was my intention.
An example of?
An example of what the progress of getting older will be like for people who haven't experienced it yet, but will, which is the boomers.
What makes the baby boomers and their approach to death different? When I was thinking of this, I thought of, did the silent generation, the generation before them, are they just kind of quietly dying off and the baby boomers are doing something different?
Well, no, these generations, you can slice it however you want. But the premise I chose was that you had Tom Brokaw's term, the greatest generation, and then that followed. The boomers had to follow that, which is a little hard just because of the title. The parents of boomers, the World War II generation, will be remembered for this enormous heroism they showed in winning World War II. And what will we have to show? And a lot of people have written about this. Joe Klein of Newsweek wrote that what we can do is crusade for legalization of pot, and that will be what we leave for our children.
It'll be a more pleasant death.
Yeah, I sort of thought we could do better than that.
What is your aspiration for sort of what baby boomers will bring to the process of getting older, dying, leaving of legacies?
Well, I said in this book that what they should do is pay off our debts. I mean, the greatest generation, so-called, died having spent all the money, run up a huge debt, government debt, run up huge personal debts, bought the car on time, and so on. What we could do that would be different, it wouldn't add up to the size of sacrifice of the greatest generation, but it would be a slight poke in the ribs at them, and also be very good for our children's generation.
Mm-hmm.
If we paid off their debts and let them proceed debt free. Now there are a lot of economists who will say this isn't the time for that. If you're a Keynesian, you believe you ought to spend money to keep the economy going. I take the position that all that is perfectly valid, but that's not what I wrote about.
You start off writing the book in large part in a very small, much smaller scale, writing about yourself. Sorry to go back to that original subject, but about Parkinson's and about your diagnosis, which you kept secret for 8 years after your diagnosis at 43. Why did you decide to come out with it then?
Well, it had reached the point where the symptoms, although they were still very minor, were noticeable. And people were starting to talk, saying, is there something wrong with Mike? I had told a number of people, not in any systematic way, but, I had told too many people to keep a secret. As we know in the journalism business, that's very hard. And most of my friends are journalists. So it was basically because I thought I couldn't get away with it.
The worst crowd to tell a secret to.
Yeah.
But then you were pretty quiet about it after initially talking about it publicly until 2014. And at that point, you wrote this really beautiful essay in The New Yorker. And I'm assuming that was the genesis of this book. Why did you decide to write about it then?
Well, people kept telling me, my agent, among others, that there was a book in this. And I kept saying, I don't want to write a book. Finally, I decided, well, if there's a book in this, I ought to write the book before someone else does. And journalists don't like...
we don't like being scooped.
Yes, and we don't like leaving a story just lying there. And I knew this was a good story.
And what was the story in your mind?
The story in my mind was basically how the boomers face life, all filtered through my own experience with Parkinson's.
And when you wrote that piece in The New Yorker 2 years ago, did you write it knowing, okay, this is the basis of the book, or you wrote it and then you decided to make it into a book?
No, I wrote it and then decided that hey, my agent is right. There really is a book here.
One of the things I think is very clever about the book is the size, because it's a small book. It's a physically small book. It's a short book, and it's called A Beginner's Guide. And that feels perfect given the subject and given the way in which it's written. Was that deliberate, or was that sort of you had what you said what you wanted to say, and you knew it was going to be concise?
Well, concise is a kind word. Thank you. It was more the latter. I sat down after I agreed to write the book. I sat down with the pieces that had already appeared, and I made some notes on stuff I wanted to add, actually lengthening the book, stretching it. One day, I guess last December or November, I was reading what I'd written, and I thought, I'm making this book worse by inflating things that were already in it. And I called up the publisher, Tim Dugan, and I said, I'm making this book worse. I think I should stop. And if you don't want to publish it because it's too short, we'll have to do something about that. But I can't write anymore. This is what I have to say. And he said, well, send it to me. And I did, and he deserves the credit for the very clever idea of making it a forthrightly small book. We don't pretend otherwise. And it's very well published. It looks great, I think.
Our reviewer, Dwight Garner, in the daily pages of the New York Times, said in his review, where he gave it a glowing review, as did Philip Lopate.
God bless.
In our pages.
God bless Dwight Garner.
Well, the good news for us is that now you can no longer use the excuse that you're writing a book to not review books for us. So we look forward to seeing you back in our pages. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Michael Kinsley is the author of Old Age, A Beginner's Guide, reviewed this week in the book review by Philip Lopate.
The streets are humming, I can feel what's coming. I say, uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh. You see me gliding, but there's something hiding in the shadow, shadow, shadow. I may be dealing with a nameless feeling, uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh. But everyone keeps saying that I look amazing, so I don't know, don't know, don't know.
That was Ben Walker from American Psycho, the musical. And here now to talk about it is Alexandra Alter. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
You got to go to the theater this week.
I know. I never get to go to the theater. I'm always at home reading books, so that was very exciting. And even more exciting, I got to see the musical of American Psycho with Bret Easton Ellis, the author of the novel, which came out in 1991. And he'd never seen it before, so he was somewhat apprehensive about the whole idea. As you can imagine, this was a hugely controversial book when it came out. Critics absolutely savaged it as a celebration of violence, as misogynistic. He received death threats. His original publisher, Simon & Schuster, canceled his contract. And
Wait, what year did it come out? Just to make everyone here feel old.
Yes. To make us all feel super old, it came out in 1991.
All right.
Yeah. And in the past 25 years, the transformation of people's response to the book, I suppose, or the way the culture has changed has been remarkable, because now, not only was it a movie and there are Patrick Bateman action figures, that's the psycho of the title, but it's become a Broadway musical, which is kind of the most mainstream art form you can imagine. So I got to see the show with him, and he was really nervous about it at first. You can imagine, how are they going to capture, the over-the-top violence of the book and the dark humor, and it actually came out pretty well in performance.
Did they pay homage to him? Did they say something from the stage? And here to see it is Bret Easton Ellis, the author?
Amazingly, he was unnoticed completely in the theater, and that was by his, I think, preference, and he didn't really want to draw attention to himself. And when he went backstage to meet the actors, nobody recognized him until he was introduced as Bret Easton Ellis.
It's so funny because I was at Tuck Everlasting a week ago, and Natalie Babbitt, the author of the book, was there, and they made a big to-do about it and, introduced her from the stage, and the actress who played Winnie came out and gave her a bouquet of flowers, and then, of course, she was besieged by fans.
He also attended opening night, but on the day that I went with him on Saturday when he first saw it, nobody took notice of him, which was kind of interesting.
He's not what he was in 1991.
But then we sat down, we talked about the book and the effect it had on him when everybody he was told his career was over. This was it. He was 26 when it came out.
How old was he when Less Than Zero came out, because his debut?
Good question. So that came out in 85, 23 or so, yeah.
Wow.
In his early 20s. Yeah, he was one of those up-and-coming young writers, along with Jay McInerney, sort of part of that whole slick 80s movement. He's published other novels since, Glamorama, Lunar Park, but nothing has defined his career in the same way as American Psycho. I think because, first of all, it was so controversial when it came out. The story is about a Wall Street investment banker whose hobbies include kind of killing homeless people and dismembering prostitutes in his apartment. It was such as he said when I interviewed him, it was such a kind of obvious metaphor for Wall Street greed and materialism and selfishness that people really got it. And then, of course, the 2000 film adaptation by Mary Harron, which starred Christian Bale, I think elevated, people's awareness of the book even more. So
it's interesting too because Jay McInerney has a sequel coming out to Bright Lights, Big City this fall.
The 80s are back.
Seriously. So how was the show?
I thought it was really fun. I mean, when you think about the initial reaction to the novel and how people really took it at face value, some cases even conflated Bret Easton Ellis with this character and said he must be a psychopath too. To see it come this far in 25 years where Patrick Bateman is singing and dancing in his underwear or wearing a pinstripe suit and prancing around the stage, and the satire aspect becomes so glaringly obvious, and the humor was so obvious. You know, during our conversation after the show, Bret Easton Ellis was saying how relevant it felt even today with all the discussion about income inequality and greed on Wall Street and sort of white male patriarchy, and the people in power still sort of, you know, clinging to it. Of course, there were a few Donald Trump lines that brought the house down when the protagonist is talking about his book, The Art of the Deal, and how it's the best business book ever written. People were really cracking up. So a lot of the things he wrote about, you know, in the late 80s are still things that we're discussing today.
Yeah, people still hate those investment bankers.
They do.
Well, I love Duncan Sheik. I thought his music for Spring Awakening was amazing. So
yes, and his music here, you know, there's a lot of 80s covers and electronic music, and it really, I think, gets the era down just right.
Let's listen to one more bit.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you.
'Cause when you've made it, what will you find? Heaven's just my state of mind. You are not moving mountains or changing lives. You're just killing while you're killing time.
Eric Fair is a veteran of the last Iraq War. His book is unusual in so many ways, mostly because the action he saw over there took place pretty much behind closed doors. He was an interrogator. His memoir about that experience and what's come out of it is called Consequence. Eric, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
This is a very brave book. When did you decide to write it, and how hard a decision was it?
Well, it was a very hard decision. I think in many ways, the other question I get is, why did I write? And in many ways, I wish I hadn't. It remains kind of a really sort of ugly story. As far as the process of deciding to write it, it started not long after I returned from my second deployment, and just a sense that the narrative about what had gone on over in Iraq and what was continuing to go on simply didn't meet with my own experiences. And so that some of those same values I'd picked up in the Army about things like honor and honesty and integrity were the things that really began to push me to start writing about what had actually happened.
Let's talk about your time in Iraq, starting with the first time. How did you end up there, and what capacity did you go to Iraq?
Yeah, well, I think with so many stories about people who ended up there, it's sort of a long and winding kind of tale. But I'd been in the Army in the 1990s and then gone on to be a police officer and then lost that job because of a heart condition. And this was right up in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. And I felt an obligation. I'd supported the invasion, and I'd been in the Army, and so I still felt a really strong commitment to the military, and I felt an obligation to be a part of the effort. And so at that point, I couldn't re-enlist because of the heart condition, and so this is when contractors were really beginning to ramp up their hiring process. And I found a way back in that did not require a health examination. And then based on some of my past experiences, I was hired as a contract interrogator.
And is that the title? The job title, an interrogator?
Yeah, that was when I received the job offer. It was as an interrogator.
But that wasn't what you sort of went in thinking you might be. How did you feel when that was what you were hired as?
Well, I was not a formal military interrogator during my time in the service. I was an Arabic linguist and what was known as a voice intercept operator. And so I'd actually tried to be hired as an intelligence analyst as a contractor. But the CACI, the contractor that was in charge of the hiring process, when they looked through my background, they realized that they could qualify me as an interrogator. And there was just a desperate need at that point to get as many interrogators over to Iraq as possible because the prison population was growing exponentially. So
you spoke Arabic, and your interrogations were in Arabic?
They were. I started when I first arrived. I started with the use of a translator, just because the Iraqi dialect was unfamiliar to me, and it had been a while since I'd used the language. But the longer I stayed and the more interviews and interrogations I conducted, I was actually able to conduct them on my own.
And what's the difference between an interrogator for a private contractor and being an interrogator for the military directly?
Well, there's no difference in terms of the way that you sort of prosecuted the job. It was essentially the exact same thing. The difference became, and the thing that everyone has talked about, is how we fit into the chain of command. It was never entirely clear. Now, as contract interrogators, all of us were prior military. And so we still, and most of us had been enlisted, so most of us still sort of viewed ourselves. We kind of stepped in as our own old ranks. So I'd been a sergeant, and so I still kind of deferred to sergeants that were higher ranking than me, and I think this was true for many interrogators. The military, I think, struggled to know how to deal with us because the military falls under civilian leadership. It's always the President of the United States at the top of the chain of command. So I think it was more complicated for them to know how to treat us.
For you, was it just the job itself, or were you concerned about that sort of larger systemic confusion when you were there?
Well, the systemic confusion was certainly concerning, but it didn't in any way affect what was going on inside the interrogation booth. So there wasn't a sense that as contractors we were under a different set of rules than, say, a soldier or a Marine was.
Did you go in there thinking, okay, I'm going to do this the right way, I'm going to do this well? Did you have sort of a plan going in about how you wanted to conduct yourself and how these interrogations would go in your mind?
Sure, yeah. And I've talked to a lot of people since writing a lot of these articles in the books, and people will say, I think when they're trying to kind of commiserate with me, that, after 9/11, I thought we should torture everyone, and this idea that people say this to me, that torture was something they would have done, and then it wasn't until later they realized they were wrong. I never, even after 9/11, I never entertained the thought that I would torture anyone. I thought of that as something illegal and something I would never do. And so when I arrived, the existence of these things that we were calling enhanced interrogation techniques seemed in some ways as if that I had an obligation to use, that these were tools that the Army and the government had approved of, and that we needed to use them to gain information.
Tell us about the first time that you used one of these methods and what that felt like.
Well, I remember certainly early on speaking with a young boy, and he was almost certainly younger than 18. He'd been captured with car batteries, and he claimed that he was using them for fishing. And at the time in Iraq, the IED problem was growing, and it was becoming a very dangerous place. And we knew that they were using car batteries to detonate IEDs. So he claimed that he was using them for fishing, which I thought was ridiculous. And so I did put him into stress positions.
What does that mean, a stress position?
So stress positions could be anything from the push-up position to long-standing, or in this case, holding folders and books out to his side until his arms gave out. It was to induce essentially muscle failure and some exhaustion. And I'm sure that people hear this and think that's not torture, that's a small thing. But in the environment of a place like Abu Ghraib, when anyone really is imprisoned in an oppressive environment, the introduction of any type of physical discomfort can be incredibly frightening and incredibly disheartening. And the idea that they have no way of escaping this, and it's not so much what they happen to be experiencing at the moment, but their mind races to what more might come. And so it doesn't work for everyone, but in some cases, some people do cooperate. And in this case, he did, and we did actually discover the location of some of these bomb factories. So
did you feel satisfied after? Well, that worked, or did you have doubts about it in the immediate aftermath?
Well, I think it was a mix of emotions. I think, yes, there was a certain euphoria surrounding the idea that you had conducted a successful interrogation, but there was no way to deny, and this was true for many of the interrogators that were there, that we immediately began to struggle with sort of this moral issue of causing discomfort. Now, certainly others, some more than others, but I wasn't questioning the legal application of these techniques, but I was certainly from the beginning questioning the moral application. Did you feel alone in that questioning, or did you have other interrogators, colleagues that you talked to? No, we had open discussions about this. Again, one technique that's outlawed is you cannot threaten a prisoner with death. And so there were interrogators wondering if you could threaten sending a detainee to a certain country where he may fear that he might be executed. And there was a lot of discussion about whether or not that was something that we could or couldn't do. And many interrogators said that we couldn't. There was open discussion about what was going on. As I've said before, none of this was being done behind closed doors. We were not afraid that we were going to get caught, or because we didn't think that we were doing anything outside the rules. Did you at any point do anything where you felt like, I know this is wrong, I don't want to be doing this, I can't be doing this? Well, again, after having 12 years to process this, I suspect that, from the very beginning, I started to, from the very beginning, I was questioning whether or not I should be doing this. But there was one, certainly in particular, a sleep deprivation in Fallujah. It was actually one of the last interrogations I was involved with, where I had been asked to go in and wake up a detainee during the night. And the first time I woke him up and stripped him down, I realized it was an assault on his well-being. And I don't know if it was that just particular incident or if it was just a combination of everything that I had seen and been involved in. But I knew at that point that I was done doing anything other than speaking directly to prisoners of war.
In your memoir, you write about how as a child you contemplated becoming a pastor. When you were over there, did you think, how did I get from there to this?
Well, it's interesting that the church and the military are in many ways very similar institutions and organizations. They both encourage things like taking care of the people around you more than you take care of yourself. In the military, higher-ranking personnel eat last. They make sure that their troops are fed, and you're always watching out for your colleagues and your comrades. The same kind of values that I'd found in the church. So it was, in many ways, making that transition from thinking about something like being a pastor to being a soldier. They felt similar. Now, it wasn't until that I actually applied the techniques of being a soldier in an actual war that I began to recognize that the two were polar opposites. And so, yes, I had thought about being a pastor, and then I think once I got to Iraq, I began to realize that I may have taken a path that was going to prevent me from ever heading back in that direction.
Did a lot of the realization of sort of what went on there only come to you after you returned to the U.S.?
Well, again, I think even while I was there, I recognized that this was going to be morally troubling. I don't think anyone goes to war and doesn't realize almost right away that this is something they're going to be processing and dealing with for the rest of their life. But in terms of essentially calling or recognizing that enhanced interrogation was in fact torture, and recognizing that I tortured someone was a difficult process. In fact, the very first article I wrote back in 2007 did not use the word torture because I hadn't made that leap then. I was still convinced that I had done something wrong and certainly morally offensive, but I hadn't processed it to that point.
Was writing the book cathartic? Was it difficult? Or perhaps both?
It was not cathartic. It was incredibly, people who have read it have told me it's very unpleasant to read and very chaotic, and that's exactly what it was to write. I talked to some other veterans who have written about their experiences as well, and I think they all agree that sort of spending 4 to 6 to 8 hours a day working through sentences and paragraphs that deal with these things is not at all cathartic, and it's painful.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you in some ways regret writing the book. Why?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. I got asked a question a few days ago about, on balance, if any good came out of the book in terms of exposing or at least kind of getting my own story out. On balance, was I still sort of happy that I'd written it? And the honest answer at this point is no. Even doing this interview now, as much as I'm obligated to continue to tell the story, and I feel that it's the right thing to do, and to be as honest as I can about my failures and not be talking about other people. On a daily basis, I'd much rather be worried about Little League or what I'm cooking for dinner, or it's spring and it's going to be time to mow the lawn soon. But instead, I'm still sort of trapped up in this event that took place 12 years ago now.
Right.
I absolutely do have regrets.
Eric, thank you.
I really do appreciate it.
Eric Fair's book is called Consequence, a Memoir. This is very exciting because we have here Viet Thanh Nguyen, who just won the Pulitzer Prize in fiction for his first novel, The Sympathizer. Viet, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I want to read what you wrote on Facebook when you found out that you won. Sorry, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit by reading you to you. Thanks for all your good wishes. I double-checked with real people in my publisher's office, and they say that The Sympathizer really did win the Pulitzer Prize. Unless this is some cosmic virtual reality trick, I'm stunned.
Absolutely. That was my first reaction. I was in a hotel room writing emails, which is the glamorous thing I do when I'm in book tour. And then all of a sudden, the Twitter feed, Facebook feed started to blow up, and I had to really double-check to make sure that was true.
So you were on tour for the paperback.
The paperback of The Sympathizer, right, and the new book, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War.
Right. So you have a nonfiction book out at the same time that this happened. You must feel like, what else do you do? Do you sing and dance? And how long were you working on this novel?
2 years, a little bit over 2 years. I had a really good opportunity where I had 2 years off from teaching, And the book was relatively easy to write, especially after over a decade of struggling with short stories. It was a really wonderful time to write this novel.
So the novel was easier than the struggle with short stories?
So much easier. I mean, the novel was easier to write than an individual short story. And I think that was because I really understand the short story form. I can get stories published, but when they appear, I'm like, okay, somebody liked it, but I have no understanding of how I achieved that. But 10 years of writing the short stories was really the preparation for writing the novel.
In the short stories, were you dealing with similar themes, similar ideas? Like, did you feel like there was actually a novel that you wanted to write and that you were writing around that in the short fiction?
No, actually, the short stories are about Vietnamese refugees or the people who intersect with Vietnamese refugees. And they were really my attempts to tell the Vietnamese American or Vietnamese refugee story. And after I finished, I was delighted to realize these stories have already been told by many other great, talented Vietnamese American writers. I didn't have to publish this book. And so The Sympathizer is a radically different kind of work, which is, yes, it deals with Vietnamese refugees to some extent, but it's mostly spy novel, political thriller, historical novel, not in the least autobiographical in any way.
Is that the first question you get asked? Is this about you?
Well, I will tell you something. This novel is about a communist spy who is a liar, a womanizer, an alcoholic, and ultimately a murderer. So fortunately, people don't think it's autobiographical.
I was going to say it would be so much more interesting in a way if that's who you really were, and we could talk about that. Tell us a little bit about the novel.
So it's about a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army in 1975 when Saigon is about to fall or be liberated, depending on your point of view. And because he's a spy, he does see both those aspects. So his job is to flee with the remnants of that army to the United States and spy on their efforts to take their country back.
When Philip Caputo reviewed you for us on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, he said it was both a thriller and a social satire. In what way is it a satire?
Well, the book has something in it to offend everyone, South Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, communists, anti-communists, Americans of all backgrounds, and that's where it's a social satire. And it was important to offend everyone because it's easy just to criticize one group, but it's much more important in a situation like war where everyone's responsible for a tragedy and so many kinds of hypocrisies and contradictions to hold everyone accountable. And that's what I was attempting to do through black comedy, through humor, through satire.
Do you think that there is a sort of progression in terms of the Vietnamese and Vietnamese American fiction that we're seeing here in this country? I mean, you talked about how all the short stories about the refugee experience had already been done, and now you're doing something a little bit different. And last year, there was another novel by a Vietnamese American author that was also a thriller, Vu Tran's Dragonfish, where you're sort of taking this into kind of new territory?
Well, I think what happens in the United States with the literary marketplace, literary industry, the way racial relations work in this country, there's a particular kind of way that minority writers are supposed to write about their minority communities. And for Vietnamese refugees, the issue is write about Vietnamese refugees. Don't write about the Vietnam War. So I really wanted to write a book that was not only about refugees, but about the Vietnam War, and to take on very directly American memory and Vietnamese memory of this war. And I think Americans are actually not used to hearing Vietnamese or Vietnamese American voices contradict their memories of this war.
You mentioned earlier that you've just written a nonfiction book. It's published by an academic press.
Harvard University Press, but it's really my attempt to reach out to a general audience. And I think of that book as the nonfiction bookend to a larger project about war and memory, for which this novel is the fictional bookend.
It's not your first academic book because you're a professor
Yeah.
at the University of Southern California. Do your colleagues at the University of Southern California and sort of being on tour for this academic book, and here you are winning the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, is it just kind of this collision of worlds?
It's really kind of wonderful. I mean, my colleagues have been so supportive. T.C. Boyle, Tom Boyle, was a very early supporter of this book, read it, gave me a great blurb. They've all been lovely to me. The irony, of course, is that academics write academic books, but truly I think this is probably the occasion where they read my novel with much more interest than my academic work.
Are you working on another novel?
The sequel to The Sympathizer, forthcoming from Grove.
All right. He did his work. Viet Thanh Nguyen, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now's the time of the week where we usually talk to Greg Cowles about bestseller news, and we are going to do that, but also to talk a little bit about the books that we're excited about here. So joining me now are Greg Cowles and Parul Sehgal. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
So we're going to talk a little bit about bestsellers and what's new on the list, but also about our editor's choices. And those, for those who don't know, are the books that we here at the Book Review thought were especially good, even if our reviewers didn't. Let's talk a little bit just about what is new on the bestseller list to start.
Sure. Well, Nora Roberts is there. She makes her debut at number 1 with a novel called The Obsession. It's her first bestseller under her own name in a year, which, you know, a book a year is still pretty prolific. But for Nora Roberts, it's kind of a slowdown. This is a woman with more than 200 books.
I thought you were going to say 200 pseudonyms, and I was getting nervous.
No, she's got just 2 pseudonyms as far as we know. She's Nora Roberts, and she's also, of course, J.D. Robb. J.D. Robb has been on the list in the past year, but Nora Roberts has not since The Liar came out last year and hit the list.
I wonder if they get jealous of each other. And we also have a new nonfiction. I think this one is no surprise, Hamilton, the Revolution, by Lin-Manuel Miranda and Jeremy McCarter, who is a theater reporter.
Yeah, this is looking at Miranda's huge hit and Pulitzer Prize-winning musical, Hamilton, which, of course, is about Alexander Hamilton. All 3 of the new books on the nonfiction list this week have to do with politics, but none of them have to do with the current political season.
I was curious because I went online to see if Hamilton, the Revolution, was number 1 on Amazon as well, and it's not. It's number 2, but I bet you can figure out what number 1 is. A book that's not out yet by an unknown author, J.K. Rowling, and that is the prequel to the Harry Potters, which is coming out in July. So that's what everyone else is reading. Let's talk a little bit about the books that we're excited about here. Parul, 2 of the books that you edited last week are among our editor's choices, and we're on our cover.
Yeah, one of them is Black Hole Blues and Other Songs from Outer Space by Janna Levin. And it's a chronicle of the development of a machine that detects gravitational waves. The other one is 7 Brief Lessons on Physics by Carlo Rovelli, which was originally published in Italy and outsold 50 Shades of Grey. And it's part of, maybe it's not a trend, I think it's this hunger I think people have for beautifully written explanatory science. And if you look over on our bestseller list, you can see, you know, again, like 7 Brief Lessons on Physics is at number 8. There's also at number 9 a book called Lab Girl by Hope Jaron, which is, again, not an obvious pick for bestseller list. It's a book about a geobiologist and her love of plants and trees, and it's very lyrical. Michiko Kakutani said that Jaron will do for geobiology what Sachs did for neuroscience. Like, it's that kind of inviting book that breaks things down very simply. And again, on the list, there's also Paul Kalanethi's book about his death. There's Atul Gawande's book about being mortal. So lots of sort of simply, beautifully written, creative books about pretty arcane science, about the expansion of the universe and the decay of the body.
Although the decay of the body, getting a little bit mundane there. We also selected Old Age, a beginner's guide by Michael Kinsley as one of our editor's choices. He was, of course, earlier on the podcast as a guest.
And a novel about decay of the body, Charles Bach's Alice and Oliver, which is a marriage novel. It's based on Charles Bach's own first marriage to his wife, Diana, who died of leukemia. And the wife, Alice, in this novel is also dying of leukemia. And he's pretty straightforward in the book's acknowledgments and in publicity that he's done for it, that it's, he sets it earlier than their own story was. That takes place in 1990s New York. But it is based very closely on the experience they went through, the nightmare of getting insurance, dealing with insurance companies, and kind of all the people they encountered going through cancer treatment.
He lives here in New York, right?
He does, yeah.
And that book was reviewed, I thought, very, very well by, I can't say positive because it was not a very positive review, but
elegant,
really intelligently and thoughtfully by Lauren Groff, who wrote Fates and Furies.
Right. Another book very much about marriage and another, very elegant writer. Charles Bach pays a lot of attention to prose, and he's acclaimed as a stylist. He was for his first novel as well, Beautiful Children. So Lauren Groff was an obvious choice to review this book. She didn't love it. She didn't necessarily believe that he had transcended the real-life material to turn it into a believable fictional story. But she was very deft in her handling of that. She found some things to praise in the book. And was generous toward the source material and said that Bach is clearly a writer who has more good books in his future.
Yeah. Such a hard review to write.
Yeah. Well, she also makes a really interesting argument. This was a book that he clearly needed to get out of his system. Like, he needed to write this book. He needed to fictionalize this trauma.
Right.
And now let's see what else he does,
right.
which I thought was really interesting.
All right. So we'll look for the next book. Okay. Parul Sehgal, Greg Cowles, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez. And if you want to get in touch about the podcast or about anything books related, feel free to email us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.